The fact that we're flawed is why we need these systems in place that can deal with those flaws and at the same time provide as much freedom as possible, as much ability to chase our dreams and find fulfillment as possible. And that's a delicate balance. But I think classical liberalism, if followed correctly, is our best bet.
Welcome to The Shape of Dialogue. Today I'm joined by Dr. Erec Smith. Erec Smith is a professor of rhetoric and composition at York College, Pennsylvania University in Pennsylvania in the United States. So welcome, Erec. Thank you very much for joining me on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. Now, to start, could you please define what rhetoric and composition is, and then give an outline of your pathway to becoming a professor in that field?
Okay, well, a thorough answer to that question would take several sessions. I'll try my best to talk about it as briefly as possible. Rhetoric, the common and most popular definition comes from Aristotle. And his definition of rhetoric is the ability to discern in any given situation the available means of persuasion. So you have to ask there, what available? Aren't all means of persuasion available to everybody if they simply know about them? Well, not if you're considering your audience and rhetorical context in general, right? Or what's called kairos in rhetorical theory, a confluence of time, place, speakers, subject matter, things like that. So, if you are speaking about police violence and before George Floyd, you're going to use different language than you probably would after George Floyd, especially immediately after. You may choose more sensitive verbiage. You may choose different metaphors, different references to history and things like that, because you're gauging your audience and feeling their emotion and concern, right? And you would address that accordingly. So harsher language isn't available to you if you are concerned about persuading, right? The point of rhetoric is to persuade ultimately. And if you really care about that, you're going to be careful about what you say and acknowledge what you can't or shouldn't say in that situation. And we'll probably get into this a little bit later, but a lot of the issues in my field and in academia in general is that, the audience is less important. Now it's about the speaker, and it's less about persuasion and more about expression. Like, I am fill in the blank, hear me roar, is the raison d'etre, as opposed to actually persuading. And I should define what I just said. I'll just repeat the whole thing in simpler terms. The very point of rhetoric is to persuade. But if you're taking it to be an expression of who you are and that you're here, right? It's less rhetoric and more of a different kind of performance. So anyway, how I got into rhetoric. Well, I was into it before I realized I was into it. In high school, I became fascinated with how groups form, their insularity, the rules of engagement from one group to another, why they differ. And this was a rhetorical endeavor. Rhetoric is also about using language to make meaning, right, and to make sense of the world in certain ways. So um, this group will have different values, attitudes, and beliefs, and different interpretations of the world. And another group will have different values, attitudes, and beliefs, and a particular interpretation of the world. Sometimes groups can overlap. Sometimes they butt heads. I was fascinated by that because I was seeing some butting of heads, and I didn't expect it, and I didn't know what to make of it. So I was like tacitly fascinated with that. it wouldn't be until graduate school that I would discover that I could get a PhD in rhetoric. I was there for American literature, and basically philosophical thought in general.
So
So
an English degree, essentially, or
yes,
an English plus philosophy.
yes. Well, I mean, it's American philosophy, and some people think that's an oxymoron. So, um,
Is it
so
isn't philosophy philosophy? I mean,
well, I mean,
yeah.
you would think so, but for example, I teach a course called American Philosophical Thought. Now, it's called that as opposed to American philosophy, so that we can talk about some key figures and what they wrote, even if they're not considered technically philosophers. Secondly, when it does come to American philosophy, you probably think first and foremost of pragmatism. William James, John Dewey, George Herbert Mead, and so many others. And that concept is known for what Cornel West calls the evasion of philosophy. We're not going to navel gaze here and think about the meaning of life. We're going to intellectualize about things that are important that have immediate consequences, right? So, I mean, that alone, right there, some dyed in the wool philosophers would dismiss that not as philosophy, but as, I don't know, something else.
Well,
So,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. Well, I mean that's interesting because philosophy has a reputation of being navel gazing.
right.
But I think if we go back to Aristotle and Plato and Socrates and all those folk, it was much more about being in the world. Would you agree with that?
Oh, definitely. It
Yeah,
was about holding forth in public,
yeah,
right? And how to design institutions in ways that are most conducive to humankind.
yeah. So
So
there,
it was about interaction, for sure.
yeah, there's real world application of thought in a sense.
Hmm.
That's
Including
interesting.
rhetoric.
Yeah, that's interesting what you said about when you're a student and your interest in the different discourses and how they merged. Because essentially, I mean, we're very much aligned in our interest there. Because I've called the podcast "The Shape of Dialogue," because in a sense, what you're defining there is a particular shape, and I think what fascinates me is how we can dialogue and how we can't dialogue. And there have been many situations in my life where dialogue is just not possible because you're not actually being able to, you're coming from different epistemologies. And that's what I'm quite interested in is that connection between diverse epistemologies and how you get that cross fertilization of dialogue.
Hmm.
And would I be correct in saying rhetoric is, in a sense, the the study of the meta discussion? Because because I mean, there's persuasion. Advertisements are persuading, and political operators are persuading. But in a sense, what I'm getting from you is that it's rhetoric is a much broader topic than just persuasion. It's really a meta view of the whole field. Is
Yes,
that what?
like I said, you can use rhetoric to persuade. You can use it to make meaning. You can use it to construct meta narratives, or the societal stories we tell ourselves to make sense of the world. Right? Those are rhetorical endeavors. How can I convince you, with a sufficient amount of logic, emotion, and credibility, right? That we should live our lives this way as opposed to this way. There are three kind of branches of rhetoric. There is the deliberative, which is basically political rhetoric. How do I convince the audience that this way forward is better than this way forward? When it comes to the well-being of society. Then there's forensic, which is more about what happened before. I'm going to prove to you that this action means this as opposed to this. So, perhaps a lawyer is using forensic rhetoric to convince a jury of the innocence of his or her client. And then there's epidactic or ceremonial, which is basically just about celebration. You're not really trying to persuade in a deliberative sense. You're not trying to convince people of actual facts and their consequences. You're trying to praise somebody or tear down somebody, right? It's less about persuasion and more about performance. It doesn't
Can,
mean persuasion isn't a part of it.
so, can you give me some examples of
Of
that?
epidactic,
Yeah.
well, a funeral oration, right, is epidactic rhetoric. You're celebrating somebody. You're not, convincing somebody of some kind of proposition or something like that. Perhaps you're convincing them that you should, you know, remember this person fondly, right? Perhaps that's the aspect of um, persuasion there. But also, it can be tearing somebody down, right?
Yeah, that
Um,
was the, and I sort of immediately got the ceremonial aspect of it, but it was the tearing someone down. I mean, what's what's the example of that?
that's a very good question. The first thing I think of are political ads. The negative ones in which you're tearing down the other opponent. There is a persuasive element to that. Obviously, vote for me instead of him, right? But ultimately, you're not attacking that person's ideas or the merit of that person's ideas. You're attacking that person's character, right? And that is more epidactic than it would be deliberative or forensic or
Right.
something like that.
So, how do you study rhetoric?
Well, I studied it by looking at its history and development. Most people start with Plato, right? I start with actually Eastern philosophy, and the Buddha talks about rhetoric, so I start there. Maybe a little Lao Tzu, whose ideas overlap with rhetoric regarding how meaning changes from one context to another, you know. Um, and then I moved through Aristotle, then the Romans, Cicero most prominently, and we get through the Middle Ages quickly. Not a big fan. Then we get to the 19th century and Nietzsche, who talked about rhetoric, into the 20th century, especially when it comes to Kenneth Burke and his work. And now, there are some rhetoricians out there who are doing very interesting things, except for in my field, you know, um, those interesting things involve a take on anti racism and social justice and rhetoric. And I feel like the field has taken a substantial turn because what used to be a focus on deliberative and forensic rhetoric is now, in my opinion, becoming more epidactic, right? It's more about performance, or as some people in my field will say, showing up and showing out. It's about expressing your personhood, your identity, right? And perhaps the persuasive element is that you should respect my identity, right? But those audience consideration isn't as prominent of a consideration as it has been previously. So the social justice turn in rhetoric has also turned it away from more traditional notions of it.
So, are there, the three forms of rhetoric? Is one better than the other, or are they all on a par? Because, in a sense, what I'm getting a sense from you is that, the last comment about social justice rhetoric and anti-racism rhetoric, it's you mentioned it was performative, but in a sense, I'm getting that it's not as high value as the other two forms of rhetoric. Is that what you're saying?
Well, they're all equally valuable in that a given context will dictate which one you should use, right? So there will be times where you can be steeped in deliberative rhetoric or forensic rhetoric. But if you're in a situation where you have to give some kind of celebratory statement or something like that, well, that's where epidictic skills come in, right?
Yeah.
So they're equal in that there are situations that are conducive to each one of them. My issue is that, deliberative rhetoric, especially, is supposed to be a primary aspect of a democratic society where everybody apparently has a voice, not just a vote, but a voice. And through deliberative democracy and freedom of speech, they can make their case for voting for a certain politician or creating a certain policy, right, or changing a certain policy or something like that. That's where deliberation comes in. And I'm seeing that focused on a little bit less in activist circles, mainly because it seems like they've given up on it, and they've given up on good faith listening to deliberative rhetoric, especially when it comes to race or any kind of advocacy for a minority group, right? So they've given up on deliberation, and now it's all about force, really, and a kind of pulling at the heartstrings or morality or guilting people into doing certain things. And
So,
obviously,
yeah,
everything is, I mean, that's rhetorical as well to a large degree, but it's not deliberative in the traditional sense.
right. So deliberative, in a sense, is a process of persuasion on particular points. So, you know, this X is better than Y sort of thing.
Mhm.
Where if remind me how to say it, is it epistemic? No, what
You, what, I'm sorry, what was your
the third
epidictic?
epidictic, yeah,
Yeah.
is it sounds like it's more didactic and with touches of authoritarianism thrown in for good measure. Is that correct? I'm it's sort of like the priesthood. I'm upon high. I have the holy word. I'm telling you how it is. Is that a good characterization?
Well, I think that characterization makes sense, and here's why. In my field, anyway, you can see an example of what or why John McWhorter calls, contemporary anti-racism a religion.
Can you just tell the audience who John McWhorter is?
John McWhorter is a professor at Columbia, primarily in linguistics, and he has a lot to say about the nature of contemporary anti-racism. Um, he's not a big fan of the methodologies, and I have to agree with most of what he says regarding that. And he kind of has a reputation, sorry, reputation for speaking against progressive left tactics, mainly because they don't make any sense or their logical progression is something that we don't want to see, like, say, segregation or the lowering of standards in schools or something like that. That's who that is. He calls this a religion because it's not about deliberation. It's about something else. It's about something more faith-based, more emotional. So when I go to a conference and I observe, I'm seeing a trend that speaks to this religiosity. When somebody gives a talk at a conference, that used to be a kind of deliberation, right? This person is making an argument for a certain viewpoint. Now it seems more epidictic, and I say that because during the Q&A, the only things you're allowed to do is praise the talk or ask some question akin to, how can I be more like you? If you actually ask a challenging question, especially when it comes to race, I'm not talking about every subject matter. When it comes to race, if you ask a challenging question, it's considered bullying. You're considered a troll. and that is less academic and more religious. Think about being in church. You don't stand up when the preacher gives his interpretation of John 3:16 and say, I'm not really following you there. I think there's a better interpretation of that." You don't do that. You just let the preacher talk. Maybe you talk about it with friends afterwards, but you let the preacher talk, right? So now academia is becoming like that. You don't challenge, you just listen and praise.
Well, going back to Nietzsche, God is dead. And although I'm not a religious man at all, never have been, and I can imagine never will be, but it seems like there's the void that God has left is being filled by these woke social justice dogmas.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that? That there's actually, in a sense, a problem. No matter what you think about religion and for all its flaws, there, in a sense, is a problem of that void having to be
Yes, I
filled.
I forget who said this, and I apologize to whoever said it, but he called it a God-shaped hole, right?
Yeah.
That we need to fill.
Mm.
Meaning that, if we don't embrace more traditional forms of religion, we'll create a new one, perhaps a secular one or something like that, to fulfill this need. And you mentioned Nietzsche. Let's go back to him and talk about the concept of resentment, right? When he talked about resentment, I believe most prominently in the genealogy of morals. Um, it's this idea of the slave mentality. I don't have what you have, so I'm going to attack you in some way for it. Or I'm just upset in general and I need to take it out on somebody, right? Um, that needs a justification. That according to Nietzsche anyway, that natural sentiment in societies needs an outlet. It needs a justification, and you can see that in a lot of contemporary anti-racism and social justice in general. A lot of their ideas don't really seem to make sense, but they are indeed pushing back on people who seem to enjoy some modicum of success or power, right? And you know, I think the Tocqueville said that the more at peace a society is, the crueler a lot of people become. Because when there is a blatant problem in society, well, there's your target. You can just project all this resentment onto that. But when there's nothing wrong, quote unquote, then the definition of wrong broadens, and more things are wrong. Things that were okay last week are now suddenly, something worth bristling over. So it's not just about God being dead and trying to either reinvigorate God or reanimate God or find a new one. It's also about finding a target for this resentment.
Yes, well, back in the day, you had a scapegoat. Um,
Right.
so I'm just trying to think. Um, he was a professor. He was French professor, a philosopher from Stanford University in the 70s, I think. I think his surname was Rene, I think. But
Mm,
anyway, I can't remember. But he talks about societies requiring a scapegoat. And if you go back to religion, Jesus Christ is the ultimate scapegoat. And that's where you single out one person and burn them at the stake, and
hmm
everyone goes away happy because we've dealt with the problem. And
right.
um, but should we just define, some terms here? First of all, I first discovered you and your work when a video from the Heterodox Academy popped up, and I'd recommend everyone listens to that. And you what was interesting about it is you're taking a rhetorical analysis of the rhetoric of anti-racism. Now, if I say anything that's not quite right, you just correct me. But what's interesting is, how can anyone be anti-racism? And I know that's not what you're saying, but I
Right.
think to someone who doesn't have a background in thinking analytically, possibly, it seems to be an oxymoron to be anti-racism.
Right.
So
Well,
do you want to just sort of outline what your concerns are there, and then also talk about what we could, call woke culture and the problems with that?
I am against racism, obviously, as every black person should be. But what I am also against are contemporary methodologies for how to go about fighting racism. What I'm seeing these days is an embrace of victimhood and an essentialism of certain groups that have been traditionally marginalized that I think is doing more harm than good.
Could you just define what essentialism means?
Yes, essentialism is when you look at a group and think, okay, they're all the same. They're not individual minds thinking individual things. They're all kind of a monolith. Which means that they all have the same reactions to certain things in the world. They all have the same desires and wants and dreams.
So
They,
a racist is an essentialist.
yes,
It's sort of the same thing.
yes,
Yeah.
right, right. But see, now the anti-racist are essentializing based on race,
Well,
right?
what I say is they're trying to fix racism with more racism.
Precisely. They're trying to fix racism with more racism. And if we wanted to put my problems with them succinctly, that's it.
Yeah,
I,
two wrongs make a right.
precisely. In fact, Ibram X. Kendi has gone as far as to say, the writer for How to Be an Anti-Racist, he has gone as far as to say the only remedy to present racism is, or to past racism is present racism, right? The only remedy to past racism is present racism. I don't agree with that. I think there are other ways to go about this, and I think those other ways, um, align with what are supposed to be classical liberal values. Critical race theorists, who, and I can explain that a little bit later on, um, they have this mistrust of classical liberal values. They think that it's basically a way to perpetuate the status quo being inherently racist, or they would say systemically racist. I believe that classical liberal values are, in and of themselves, social justice. Why? Well, because they embrace and respect individuality, which is the opposite of racial essentialism, right? Each group has a bunch of individuals and not a bunch of clones. Freedom of speech, there's that. A primacy of reason, obviously deliberation, right? Um, ownership of property, all these different things. But the most prominent values regarding classical liberal value: individuality, freedom of speech, equality, obviously, primacy of reason. These things are good for social justice. The issue with classical liberalism is that throughout its history, we often fail to live up to those values, right? You can't talk about equality but enslave people, right? That is a contradiction that a lot of people point to when they're downplaying the value of classical liberalism. I think we should keep classical liberalism and just do it better. And when we do it better, it does benefit marginalized groups. For example, let's look at freedom of speech. Rich people don't need that law, right? Jeff Bezos does not need that law. It would just be like, oh, you're going to shut me up? Here's $1 billion that I just pulled out of my couch cushions. Go ahead and have that. The freedom of speech is for the little guy, right? It's for the marginalized, the powerless, so that the people who have power don't try to silence them because they don't like what they're saying. That's who freedom of speech is for. Now, there are a lot of people in contemporary anti-racist circles who equate freedom of speech, right, with inherent hate speech, right? Freedom of speech means the bullies are allowed to talk, right, as opposed to the would-be victims of the bullies are allowed to talk, but they won't be victims because freedom of speech. So that's one of the ways that I see classical liberalism as being itself social justice, not the opposite.
Yeah, I completely agree with all of that. Can you just define what social justice is?
I can't.
Yeah.
and,
I'm
and,
I,
and
I'm
yeah,
always wary of important words with modifiers in front of them, like social justice.
yes,
Um, it's a bit like we at the start of the conversation when you said American philosophy. To me, it's philosophy, and
yeah,
you just happen to be born in America. And social justice, well, there's justice. There's, which is actually an incredibly hard word to define. You have to
yes.
go back to Plato and Socrates, and uh, but when you start adding social justice, well, what is it? I find that quite interesting that someone of your intellect is actually struggling to define what it is.
Well, I struggle to define it because every time I come across it, there's a different definition.
Right. It's
You
whatever
know,
you
S-
want it to be, in a
right?
sense. Yeah,
It's
it's
whatever you
more,
want it to be.
yeah, it's
I
more
mean,
a tactical weapon than actually something that's has a real meaning in the world.
it's definitely being used that way.
Yeah,
I think of social justice as fairness and the affordance of equality on as many people as possible.
yeah,
But that's not the definition that a lot of people use.
yeah. And just going back to classical liberal values, in a sense, I see them a bit like the Platonic forms. They're these ideals that we're all striving for. Well, hopefully, as many people as possible are striving for.
Hmm.
But because we're mere mortals, we um, we fail. We succeed, but we also fail. And I think the founding fathers are the perfect example of that. How you could come up with something like the American Constitution, which is essentially a set of protocols to maximize as much freedom and flourishing as possible, and then hold slaves. And I think from the social justice warriors' point of view, they have a very myopic, and I would say, all due respect to them, but very ignorant view of it. They take one variable that, was it Benjamin Franklin held slaves, but they don't actually understand that he was a human in his time in a particular context. You talk about you talk about in rhetoric how context and temporality is important,
Hmm.
and I just see that it's a bit like they look at the past through today's lens,
Right.
and you can't do that because if we were, if I was um, born 200 years ago as a European, I would be highly, highly racist
Hmm.
against anyone with dark skin. It would be very unlikely. The probability of me being an enlightened individual would be very low. But because I'm born in more enlightened times, I've got access to better ideas. I've got essentially access to a better set of protocols, which make society on a whole better, and which is good for all participants. So yeah, so do you want to talk about sort of their myopic view of life, or particularly history?
Well, we should know that the founding fathers didn't all agree about slavery. Many of them wanted to get rid of it, but this was a compromise to satisfy these southern states, and just move along with the founding of this country. I'm I'm actually less interested in defending the founding fathers as people as I am defending their ideas.
Yes.
Um,
Well,
I,
I
I,
think that's the really important distinction,
yeah,
where the knowledge is not tied to the knower or the
yes,
producer of that knowledge.
and there are people in my field, in academia in general, who commit what's called a genetic fallacy, right? If somebody in the past, had some kind of idea, that idea is tainted because that person was bad, you know, and it goes as far as to say that classical music is inherently racist because it was created at a very racist time.
Well,
You know,
it's the argument against architecture. Hitler used architecture to kill 6 million Jews, so therefore we should all be against architecture.
right?
That's how ridiculous the argument is.
Yeah, and there are people really making those arguments.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
Hitler didn't like jazz, so does that make jazz better than classical music? It,
They probably would say yes. I don't know.
yeah, exactly, exactly. Well, I think the abandonment. I mean, we can. It is sadly, tragically, it's actually comical, the thinking that the woke are producing, because it seems to be so easily debunked. I mean, I'm just a humble music teacher. I'm a musician. I've spent 1,000 years teaching kids to play music. Yet I can, without too much intellectual rigor, debunk their ideas quite simply. Um, but what is interesting is that how these ideas are taking root, and what you're talking about, how they've become prevalent in academia. In New Zealand recently, we've had a group of uh, academics from Auckland University wrote a letter to the editor of a national magazine called In Defence of Science. So their concerns were that the traditional Maori knowledge. Maori were the first people to arrive in New Zealand in about 1300. That traditional Maori knowledge was starting to be included in the science curriculum, and they had, I think, very valid concerns that the metaphors were being mixed, non-scientific information, um, obviously important information, but nevertheless non-scientific, was being
Yeah.
included in the science curriculum. And there was a massive uproar about it. And over 1,000 academics signed a letter against these 7 professors. So in New Zealand, this ideology, this woke ideology of sort of non-critical thinking, has also taken hold. Why do you think it's happened? What is the appeal?
Well, it's been around. Well, let's talk about critical social justice. Well, let's first talk about critical race theory, which comes out of critical legal studies, and it was, pretty much housed in law schools for the major part of its, existence. And what that does is there's a inherent distrust of classical liberalism. There's that. We talked about that already. There's this concept of intersectionality, which means that no person is just one thing. I'm not just black. I'm a black male, middle class, you know, and so on. And we should consider those things when judging somebody, and not just skin color or something like that. I say we shouldn't even do skin color, but whatever. There's the concept of interest convergence, and what that means is that I'll put it as simply as possible. Um, Good things happen for people of color only when they also benefit white people. Other than that, they won't do it. So Derek Bell, a prominent, if not the prominent, critical race theorist, looks at desegregation of schools in the 1950s in America. That wasn't done because it was the right thing to do. It was done to show the world how open-minded we are, as opposed to those quote unquote commies, right? Um,
So
so
a form of virtual
yes,
signaling, right?
yes. So we talk about that. I mean, the concept of interest conversion transcends race. That's kind of how the history of humankind has happened, right? I'm not, it's transactional in a sense.
Mm.
You know, white people do it to white people. I mean, that's what. But anyway, that's a different
Well,
conversation.
well, I mean, just on that point, I mean, the word slave comes from the word Slav.
Yeah,
So I think, probably from the Romans, they just enslaved the Slavs.
yeah,
So it's, white on white brutality.
right,
Yeah.
right. So yeah, so you know, tenets like that are part of critical race theory, but that has morphed into what's called critical social justice, which is a lot more dedicated to the us versus them idea, the oppressor versus the oppressed. There's this narrative of victimhood and being colonized and things like that. And in that narrative, there are certain roles, and people are cast in those roles, no matter who they are, based on how they look, right? Their ethnic heritage or something like that, which again is essentialist and racist. But they really run with that, and they firmly believe that racism is always already happening. Right? One of the tenets of critical social justice is to not ask whether something racist happened, but to ask how it manifested in that moment. Something racist definitely did happen. In fact, if there's any kind of interaction between a person of color and a white person, that is an inherently racist interaction. According to them, somehow you are being racist right now.
Yeah.
So we're talking right now.
Well,
Somehow you're being racist
I,
and you're
I'm
oppressing me.
I'm glad you picked that up.
Yeah. So
I was trying to hide it, but
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. Well, CRT morphs into CSJ. Obviously, CRT is still its own thing, but it has these, in my opinion, bastardizations out there, and one of them is called critical social justice. And more scholars were embracing this idea, including Robin DiAngelo, who's popular for writing books like White Guilt and Now Nice Racism. She's a self-proclaimed critical social justice scholar, right? So they're popping up more and more, and then 2020 happens with the death first Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. Things blow up. Race is first front and foremost, right? In the American psyche, in the Western psyche, really. And what this does is really it shoots critical social justice into the stratosphere, right? Because this needs to be punished. This ideology and these activists and scholars seem really serious, and there's an inherent indictment of whiteness. Not white people, whiteness, right? And that was embraced, and the authors of these books ran with it. And they travel the country speaking about these things. A lot of erroneous views, in my opinion, and that's where we are now. And I see the detriments of critical social justice in not just in college classrooms, but in K through 12 now. Right? I just attended a conference called Parents Unite about parents, scholars, even some of the students giving presentations about how critical social justice is manifesting in their schools, not as subject matter per se, but as educational methodology, right? How the teachers are teaching, right? They're starting to see this, and they're starting to segregate students, and
Sorry,
presenting students with the
sorry.
narrative that I talked about
You're
before.
saying they're segregating students. You mean they're segregating students by race? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, yes,
Right. So, so good old classroom apartheid.
yep.
Right. Sorry, I must be wrong. I thought apartheid was bad, but obviously I've got that wrong.
Yes, in fact, you're racist for saying that.
Right.
Actually, yes,
Yeah. Well, yeah.
yes,
Most things I'll say will be racist, I imagine, today.
yeah.
um, yeah, it is fascinating. I mean, I've looked into this, and again, what I always try and do is get to the core of an issue, where it's come from. The And correct me if you think I'm wrong, but what I see is it stemming from the postmodernist thinkers, the Frankfurt School that emerged out of the 30s, I think it was 20s and 30s,
Hmm.
and has sort of then morphed into what we have today, where is a critique of the underpinning ideas of Western society, which is those classical liberal ideas you're talking about. And if you go further back, you talked about oppressor and the oppressed dichotomy. I mean, that is pure Marxism.
Hmm. Yes, ethno-Marxism, I guess we can call it.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, it doesn't matter. You just choose your category. You've got the oppressed and the oppressor, whether it's white
Hmm.
on black or you can go to any society. You can
Right,
have a Marxist take on it.
right.
Um, so is that gets back to is if all of this coming from the left?
Is all of the social
What?
justice and the kind of
Yeah,
neo-Marxism?
the critical race theory, the critical legal theory, um,
Well,
the stuff teaching in schools.
yes,
These theories.
it's coming from the left. However, the left doesn't have a monopoly on dividing people based on race. You
No,
know,
no. Well,
right?
that's I think it's very much the historical swing of the pendulum, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you that's what I find. I mean, I've come to the conclusion that um, I find the left and right dichotomy a bit meaningless because if you look historically, the sands shift over time,
Hmm.
and what I find tragically humorous about the situation is that the progressives now seem to be using tactics that resonate with racist policies from the past. I mean, just mere segregation. That is it should be an anathema to all of
Right.
us in our societies.
Yes. I agree wholeheartedly.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, well, um, again going back to Plato, he was big on education and winning the education narrative is a very powerful position to hold. And it seems the type of people who are attracted to education tend to be the, they tend to be what I call the narrative classes, um, people which tend to be people on the left. And so you have this slow move to what I imagine to give them their credit, all they're trying to do is make the world a better place.
Hmm.
Would you agree with that?
The teachers?
The proponents of critical race theory, critical legal theories,
Well, I mean
the woke in general.
that depends on the angle you take. I mean, I think a lot of them just want to make the world a better place, and a lot of them may be abiding by the Frankfurt School, especially the '60s and '70s Frankfurt School, which saw a lot of benefit for them in a lot of the civil rights protests and things like that, especially the Black nationalist protests. That's the new proletariat. Let's ride this. You know, into bringing down classical liberalism and capitalism. Um, So I mean, well, I'll put it this way: there was a philosopher named Kenneth Burke who talked about certain frames in which we can see society, or at least certain situations. And he devised the comic frame and the tragic frame. The comic frame basically says, "Oh, these people aren't bad; they're misguided. They're just mistaken. You know, they're at worst they're useful idiots, right?" But then there's the tragic frame, and the tragic frame is these people aren't misguided; they're bad, right? They're doing this. They have an agenda to tear down classical liberalism and build up something else. And if they are abiding by Frankfurt School ideology and desires, they want to replace that with something more akin to communism.
Yeah.
Um,
But
or,
I would sort of disagree in a sense.
mhm,
You know, I would say I agree that they're bad, but from their own perspective, I think they're trying to do good. So there's a moral imperative that they have, and they have a very, very, a zealot-like moral imperative to
mhm,
do what they think is good. So, take a
right,
boring example, but Hitler. I mean,
yeah,
if there ever was a bad person, I think he'd be number one candidate. But I think from his perspective, he was trying to make Germany a better place. But I think also you have to uh, put into the mix that he was, there's a certain amount of egotism involved.
right, right,
Always got to consider that in a political operator. But if you take Stalin, you know, I mean, again, I think you could say he's probably worse than Hitler. But in a sense, they had a set of ideologies, or an ideology which they thought was um, the salvation to their country, and they implemented it.
hmm yes. And so I mean, we can look at them in kind of the comic in a sense too. In that they mean, they think this is the right way to go, and they will accomplish it by any means necessary,
Yeah. I
right?
mean, if you go back to some Roman emperors, I think Nero was definitely bad. I don't think
Yeah,
he had an idea of like, let's make Rome a better place,
right.
or Caligula, or I think Tiberius. They were pretty bad people, as opposed to, say, Augustus and Marcus Aurelius. Um, but yeah, I think that is in a sense the problem, is you've got two sides of the argument which both think they're doing good.
Hmm.
And you've got one side which is using, uh, was the term deliberative rhetoric,
Hmm.
which is using reason, argument, consideration of both sides, empirical evidence. And then you've actually got the other side, which is just completely narrative driven, which um, which tends to be, I mean, I think the difference between, say, classicism and romanticism, romanticism was a focus on emotions, on feeling over fact, um, on the focus on group identity. There's probably a few more things. And when I look at the woke, that's what they seem to be imbibing and appealing to.
There definitely seems to be a romanticized self-image among the contemporary activists, or the woke, as many people call them. Yes, they think they're on. They're the chosen ones doing the right thing, and they're martyrs in a sense. And they're always oppressed, and they have to fight the oppressor. And I mean, when they say they're always oppressed, they're saying that with substantial money in the bank and education and things like that. But then there's this narrative that says that they are always already oppressed, and they have to push back on this,
Yeah,
in order to be good people for the good of the world.
but they're doing that while they're on their iPhone, and while they're living in a comfortable, warm, insulated home, in a
Right.
safe environment with education, healthcare, and science to back them up, which
And,
have all are all derivative of the Western classical liberal thought.
mhm,
So
yeah,
they're in a sense they're fighting the hand that feeds them. That's going back to what I said before. They seem to have a very jaundiced view of history.
right. And even contemporarily, even when they are, trying to help downtrodden people, people who don't have money in the bank and things like that, they're talking about racism when they're really talking about a classism, or at best a combination of race and class. And you can do that if you go back into ideas like segregation, right? And how that, cutting people off from certain aspects or certain areas in a society also cut off certain jobs, which perpetuated, class distinctions and things like that. And that has residual effects contemporarily, to some degree. However, it's 2021. It's not 1951. Things have changed to the point where there are avenues and opportunities that were not available back then. The idea of segregation, real estate isn't perfect today. Okay. I'm not saying, there isn't racism going on in that general institution, right? But it's if I want to move into a neighborhood, and the house is available and I have the money, I can probably pull it off. You know, probably nobody's going to block me. These issues are not as unbearable, right? They're not the Leviathan they used to be back in the day, but they're being considered as that. There are people who still use terms like, we're enslaved, right? And they're not saying that metaphorically. You know, they're trying to say it as literally as possible. That's what they mean. There's a professor. I want to say her name is Shannon Sullivan. I'm probably getting it wrong. I think her last name is Sullivan. She wrote a article about certain understandings of time, and there's a white understanding of time and a non-white understanding of time. And the non-white understanding of time, things are not linear so much as they are on top of each other. So 1492 is today, 1619 is today, right? All these other dates that mark, bad times for people of color are still happening. And she says explicitly in the essay, I'm not being metaphorical.
Right.
This is, it's still going on in a large sense. I think that's a very dangerous idea. I'm trying to be nice. I want to call it stupid. Um, but
Well,
I think it's a very,
yeah,
yeah,
it's hysterical.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And what's more, I mean, okay, so if that's the case, what about the good things? You
Well,
know,
obviously there aren't any good things if you're still
you're right,
enslaved,
right,
And I mean, we only can see what we can see. So if you convince yourself there's only X and not Y, you'll never be able to see Y. And also, there's also the imperatives, whether they're financial or academic, or just performative rewards of leading and saying these sort of things within your own group.
yeah,
Can we talk about, well, actually, before we talk about what I was going to, the next thing, but I just want to get your take on race. Um, I'm, you know, I would class myself as a humanist, so I'm not really concerned about, where you're from, what race you are. As long as you're a human being, we're on the same level. Um, I see race as, people talk about Black America or people of color. What they're talking about is the degree of melanin in
yeah,
skin. So the difference between me, I'm a a white pasty European, um, you've got beautiful dark skin. Now, the difference is that you've got more melanin than I have. I have virtually no melanin. You have the perfect amount, and I can tell you from a person of low melanin, I'm incredibly envious of people with high degrees of melanin. It's not fun. Um,
Okay.
so this is why I find the discussion of race uh, quite, in a sense, quite boring and almost ridiculous. Because are we just talking about the degree of melanin in our skin? Having said that, I am fully aware that groups get classed by how they look, and the history of the world is replete with terrible examples of terrible things happening to people because of how they look. I'm not diminishing that, but if you look at it from just an essentially as if you're a Martian coming down to Earth, is that not the only difference between, say, me and you on a
Um,
very
fr-
superficial level?
from a biological perspective,
Yeah.
everything you're saying is true. From a historical and cultural perspective, there are stark distinctions, people would say, right? I think we're at a time when we need to, um, acknowledge that those distinctions are going away and the gaps are closing substantially. And we can also acknowledge that where the gaps aren't closed, we are in a good position to close them, right? By working together and doing that. That is not the take you see by a lot of anti-racist activists and scholars these days. They think the gap is there to stay. Derek Bell actually had a term called racial realism. And this idea was that racism is never going away. The only reason to fight it is to maintain a sense of dignity, right? Um, so if that's the idea, then you're not going to celebrate how far we've come and have hope for how far we can get. You're just going to see this as a perpetual fight between oppressor and oppressed, which is a vastly different way of looking at the world.
Can you talk about primacy of identity at the base of your thesis, which is at the base of anti-racist rhetoric?
Yes. So the primacy of identity is what it used to be called. It's still called identity politics. I call it the primacy of identity because the original version of identity politics wasn't what it is today. It was it came out of a group of feminists called the Combahee River Collective, and they came to the understandable conclusion that people of a certain group need to advocate for that group just to make sure that everything that group needs is being taken care of. Even some of the best intentioned people outside of that group may miss some things that group needs, right? Or may not agree that that group needs certain things that that group thinks it needs. So that group itself needs to advocate for itself,
Yeah,
but it should
you've got
also work for others,
yeah, you've got to fight your own fight. No one else is going to fight your fight for
right?
you.
But it doesn't
Yeah.
mean you don't work with others
Mm.
to fight the fight, especially when you have what are called superordinate goals. Two different groups have the same goal. Achieving something will benefit them both, and even if they're totally disparate groups, now they're working together. It tends to enhance collegiality and open-mindedness and diversity. Actually, the ultimate superordinate goal would be staving off an alien attack, right? Like every Earthling needs to get together to
Maybe
fight
that's
that,
maybe that's what we need.
right? Maybe
Yeah.
that's what we need.
Yeah.
So, wow, I forgot what I was talking about with that alien
Just
invasion image.
going the primacy of identity
Right. Okay.
and
So,
how that's at the base.
so I call it the primacy of identity now because it's more narcissistic. It's about, like I said before, I am fill in the blank. Hear me roar. I have no interest in considering my context or my audience or something like that. I am going to essentialize. That's another aspect of it. You know, there's a certain unwritten rules about how to be black, and there are certain unwritten rules about what it is to be white. Right? And we're going to essentialize. You know, if you look like this, you are supposed to act like this. Nicole Hannah Jones calls it being politically black, and I guess she would call me unpolitically black or apolitically black. I don't know. Others would call me multiracially white, right? So I may not actually be white, but I'm white. You
So
know,
it's addressing your argument with that ad hominem, because
yes,
they're not trying to compliment you with those words.
no,
Yeah,
no, they're
they're
not.
yeah. So again, this is what I find so interesting. There's never a well, I haven't seen it, a refutation of what you're saying or what anyone's saying,
Mhm.
but they immediately go to the gun, essentially.
Well, yeah, and I mean, if I call somebody a name, I'm going to explain why I'm doing it first, and then further explain after I do it. You know, it's call it a ad hominem sandwich of sorts, if you will. But and that's a rhetorical situation that I've embraced lately. I think we need to start ridiculing ridiculous ideas
Yeah,
and
well,
not
yeah,
pulling punches. They're definitely not pulling punches, and they tend to see an attempt at civility as almost a kind of weakness. They tend to. I mean, I've seen this enough. They tend to attack more when somebody's trying their best. To understand and to explain themselves and things like that. So we should do that. But that's a different conversation. Another aspect of primacy of identity is this overemphasis on lived experience. It's good to talk about your experiences and to present things in the form of a story that gets through to a lot of people more. But there also is, you're not perfect. Lived experience is not in itself a, a primary way of knowing because that's your experience. What if somebody had a totally different experience? You know, are you who's right? Right? According to the woke, their experience is always right, and somebody else's experience is just a result of a colonized mind, or something like that. And when you ask, when they give their experiences and you ask for clarification, that's seen as inherently insulting. How dare you, doubt or even question, what's happened to me or what I'm telling you has happened to me anyway. What's more, some people embellish. I know for a fact that there's a leader in my field who shared his lived experience, and I'm like, that didn't happen like that. I was around. That's not so lived experience is a tricky thing. It's a valuable thing, but it should be a supplemental thing. It should supplement more sound arguments and reasoning. It shouldn't be the reasoning,
well, I
right?
think
Quote unquote reasoning.
that
So yeah,
is that's at the essence of the transition from childhood to adulthood. A child only can experience their own experience.
hmm,
They can only think in terms of their own existence, where an adult moves beyond that. Is essentially sort of gets to theory of mind. But
yeah,
yeah, so
yeah,
what their methodologies or their approach to discourse seems, again, to use your word, extremely narcissistic and childish.
yes. And in fact,
But
I
yeah,
accuse them of self infantilization often.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Well, and that's one thing to infantilize yourself, but it's actually more tragic to infantilize a whole groups, especially
right,
groups you're trying to help. Yeah, because basically life is difficult for all of us. Um, you know, the I'm a mad fan on Bill Burr, the comedian.
Hmm.
He said, excuse my French, but he said, we're all living what is it? All living a shit sandwich. We've all got a shit sandwich, and we just got to deal with it. And the, what you talk about in your book, which we should mention as well, I'll get you to do that in a second, but is the theory of empowerment rather than disempowerment. So you've said that the anti-racist rhetoric is disempowering for the people they're trying to help. And what you're proposing is a theory of empowerment. So do you want to talk to that, and also maybe mention your book? Because I've started reading your book. I'm about a quarter of the way through, and
Okay.
it's fantastic. I'd highly recommend people read it.
Thank you. I had an interview the other day published in which the interviewer said quite explicitly that he could not recommend this book and that he hated everything in it.
And
So
what was so wrong with it out of interest?
I'm not entirely sure.
Right. Did he actually
Um,
read it?
yes,
Okay.
he read it. Although when I mentioned certain things in it, he tended to look like he forgot or something, which is fine. I mean, we have busy lives.
Yeah.
But anyway, regarding empowerment theory, chapter 2 of the book in question, which is called A Critique of Anti-Racism in Rhetoric and Composition, the subtitle being The Semblance of Empowerment. In chapter 2, I talk about, well, what is empowerment? And I mention empowerment theory, put forth most prominently by the psychologist Mark Zimmerman, but also quite eloquently by the social worker Judith A.B. Lee. And what they talk about is that empowerment is a three-pronged thing. There's the interpersonal component to empowerment, the interactional, and the behavioral components of empowerment. The interpersonal is basically how we self-manage, how we're self-aware. And as I argue in an upcoming book, how we talk to ourselves, how we talk ourselves into things or out of things. What kind of rhetoric do we use on ourselves? Um, Getting to know oneself and getting to effectively and healthily manage one's emotions will put them in a better place to be productive when they're interacting with others, which brings us to the second component of empowerment, the interactional, which is basically how we interact productively with others. We go from the individual to the individual in society. And then the behavioral component is how we work together to get things done, those superordinate goals, I talked about earlier. So you have to have all three to be empowered, apparently. So I think if we embrace that, then a primacy of identity would melt away, because a lot of that is about, you know, um, not feeling secure, in certain environments. Let's say a black person in a predominantly white environment, right? It's about not feeling secure. The interpersonal component helps deal with that, right? It helps manage that in more productive ways. It aligns substantially with emotional intelligence and the true sense of that term, and not the woke sense, which we can kind of talk
Yeah,
about.
well, yeah. Can you define the sense you're talking about?
Um, Emotional intelligence is one's ability to be self-aware, to self-manage one's emotions, to be socially aware, to understand like the social dynamics of a place you're in and other people, right? And to manage relationships, in healthy and productive ways. And there are various, competencies within those components of um, emotional intelligence. But the idea is that if you can work on those things, then you will be better able to address problems in society. If you're doing it from an insecure place where you're always defending your ego or protecting your ego from other people to the point where a mere critical inquiry is considered harm, right? Then you're not going to be able to interact in productive ways with others and work with them to improve society. You will be able to do that if you're empowered. So empowerment is by no means a panacea. It's not a magic bullet. It's not a thing that will solve everything. It's the first step, right? If you are empowered in this sense, you will be better able to tackle school disparities, right? You'll be better able to tackle some kind of institutional discrimination that's going on, right? So it's the necessary first step that we're not taking, and the people I talk about in the book are definitely not taking it, and they need to.
Yeah, so it's if you were to win the gold medal at the Olympics, you have to do a lot of work on getting fit.
Yeah,
So you have to be strong
right,
before you can run in the race.
right,
Yeah, because
right,
basically, going back to what I said before, life is hard, um, and it's the stronger you are, the more able you are to change what needs to be changed.
right.
Because what I find interesting about the woke is they're always talking about change. They often don't define it,
No,
and there's this great big sort of word which they all genuflect to, but with real change does actually start from the individual. So in a sense, it's I mean, it aligns with Stoic philosophy, I imagine.
yes, it does.
So about resilience and anti-fragility.
Right. And
Um,
notice this isn't about suppressing emotions or trying to avoid them. It's about displacing them, or it's about channeling them, working, using them to work in your favor as opposed to against you. You know, ruining ideas, overpowering your faculties of reason. Right. So we're not pushing down. The Stoics didn't, dislike emotion. They just wanted to make sure that people weren't being overtaken by those emotions. Right.
yeah, well, we're you can't eliminate emotion because we're emotional animals.
Right.
you know so it's all part of the mix, but it's like you can have too much of a good thing. Too much emotion is not going to get you anywhere if you want to fly to the moon.
Yeah.
you know you have to have deliberative reason processes. I mean, but having said that, when they got to the moon, I'm sure it was very emotional. um,
Yes.
so so there's a I mean, that's you mentioned John Dewey in your talk, and I have to admit my ignorance. I wasn't familiar with him, and I looked up his line of thinking, and that's part. Am I correct? That's sort of part of the pragmatist ethos.
Yes. Yes. It is. And the pragmatist ethos is, well, missing from a lot of anti-racism, because it is very idealist. You know, it is about symbolic gestures and things like that, even if they're not presented that way. That's basically what they are. Bill Maher has an excellent joke about this. He says, like, in China, they can build a bridge in 2 days, but here we spend like 2 weeks arguing about what to call it.
Yeah.
You know, it's that is a severe lack of pragmatic thought. And Dewey was very clear that in order to improve society, we have to work together in pragmatic ways. It's not just going to get better itself. We have to deliberate, work together, and figure out the best way to go about this. Right.
And
And yeah,
yeah, and if to work together, you actually have to. It has to for it to be successful. It has to start from a positive place, in the sense that we agree on all these norms, we agree on these methodologies, X, Y, Z, as opposed to the critical race theories and the critical ethos. It, it's negative. It's not actually saying these are things that are good and this is how we can make them better. It's saying it's all bad.
yeah,
Um, and the irony is that the heart of what I, again, to use the term, I don't really like this term, but Western philosophy, Western thinking. Um, but I don't like it because it's in a sense a bit parochial. Really, it's just a set of ideas, set of protocols that can be used by anyone. But at the heart of Western thinking is criticism, is cynicism,
Hmm.
and the ability to say, so if you say something and I disagree with it, I mean, I think it's you want to be. Well, put it this way: I'm always cynical, or maybe critical is a better word, critical of what other people are thinking, even if I agree with it. And I'm always trying to be critical of what I'm thinking, even if I agree with what I'm thinking, because I never know. I never know if I'm wrong.
Right.
I'm always wanting to find the weaknesses in arguments, because then I'll get to a better place. I like that Sam Harris line. Sam Harris said he wants to be wrong for the shortest possible time.
Yeah.
So he's
Yeah, that's
always,
good.
yeah. But what I find interesting about critical race theory, critical legal theory, critical XYZ, is that it's just taking one element of of a really coherent philosophy. It's like taking one tool. It's like taking a saw to everything
Well,
and cutting everything up, rather than actually using the other tools. To build a house, you need a saw, a hammer, and a screwdriver, amongst other things.
right.
It's like they're always chopping.
Well, critical, their use of critical isn't our use of critical when we think of, say, critical thinking or something like
Right.
that.
Okay.
Their critical is kind of a synonym for, counterculture or counter hegemonic. What I mean by that is, you're negatively critical of the powers that be. You're not approaching it with an open, mind or anything like that. You've already made up the fact that this has to go, right? And you're going to tear it down, because those are the tools you seem to have. Um,
So it's
Obviously,
revolution. It's
yes,
revolutionary in nature.
right. It's revolutionary in nature, and the people who came up with these ideas, people from the Frankfurt School and things like that, were explicit about that.
Yeah. Do you know the work of Professor Stephen Hicks?
Not directly, no.
So I'll, hopefully I've got this right, but his um, his his thoughts on the matter is that the Marxists lost the economic argument. It became manifestly apparent that the communist economics was going nowhere,
Right,
and capitalist economics was, producing abundance beyond belief. So they changed their strategy cultural, to the cultural sphere,
right,
and I think you could argue that they've done a fantastic job in taking over that narrative. And instead of being critical of the the employer employee, oppressor oppressed narrative, now they're critical of, they're taking up the mantle of racism, sexism, uh, homophobia. Again, all of these things which are identity based. So it's sort of cultural. It actually just occurred to me then. It is um, essentially, uh, you know, based on who you are and your
yeah,
immutable. I'll actually backtrack. It's based on immutable characteristics. If I'm a gay black woman, somehow that has um, meaning in that ideology.
yeah,
Where in, going back to classical liberal terms, it doesn't really matter what you are, does it?
right. It's not supposed to anyway.
Yeah. But
Yeah,
you see, that's again going back to the Platonic forms. These ideals that are out there. The problem is they're implemented by human beings,
yeah,
and we're all prejudiced. We're all fallible, and we've all got limited knowledge.
yeah.
So we get, it's like, there's more, whenever you do something, there's more ways of getting it wrong than right.
And Yeah, and that's kind of why we have classical liberalism and governments kind of based on classical liberalism. I think it was either Madison or Hamilton, one of the founding fathers, who said, "If men were angels, we wouldn't need government." Right? I mean, the fact that we're flawed is why we need these systems in place that can deal with those flaws and at the same time provide as much freedom as possible, and as much ability to chase our dreams and find fulfillment as possible. And that's a delicate balance. But I think classical liberalism, if followed correctly, is our best bet when it comes to that.
Oh, beautiful! That's beautifully put, and I think we'll leave it there. It's a
Okay.
great way to end it. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast, and it's been a great honour to talk to you. Do you want to just tell people where they can see your work? And before you do that, I'll just point out, if you haven't read it in the notes, Erec is EREC. It doesn't have an I in it. So otherwise, I'm sure there are lots of Erec Smiths out there who aren't you with an I in it. But yeah, just tell people where they can find your work.
Well, I have writing in Heterodox Academy, Quillette, Ario magazine, as well as City Journal and Newsweek, which are American based, really. And you can also, find me on YouTube. I'm doing a lot of talks and podcast interviews like this, in which I express, things like this and other things. My Twitter handle is at rhetoricofyork.com. I mean, not .com. Rhetoric of York. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. At Rhetoric of York. And there's an underscore between each word, Rhetor underscore of underscore York. And you can see a lot what's going on there. Also, I am a co-founder of what's called Free Black Thought, which is a website that showcases the diversity of viewpoint within the Black intelligentsia. Right? I don't even like that kind of essentialism, Black intelligentsia, but for the sake of brevity, let's just put it that way. There's more than one kind of Black person, contrary to so many people's beliefs. So we wanted to show that explicitly. There's also a journal of Free Black Thought that you can get to through that website that showcases writing that from Black authors that you don't typically see in the mainstream media. So if you Google Free Black Thought or just go to freeblackthought.com, you can check that out as well.
Great. Well, I'll put all those in the show notes so people can just click and get straight to it. But
Okay.
yeah, just want to say thank you once again for a great conversation. And
Thank you for having me.
yeah, and heads up for congratulations for your work. I think it's great stuff.
Thank you.